am Claire, 33 years old, and my husband lived a double life that blew up right over his open grave. After he died suddenly, his secret family from Ohio crashed the funeral demanding his tech empire and our $2 million home. My attorney begged me to fight them in court, but I looked at their smug faces and said, "Let them have it all." My friends thought grief had destroyed my mind. At the final hearing, I signed the transfer papers and handed over the keys. They were celebrating their absolute victory right up until their arrogant lawyer turned pale, his hands shaking violently as he read the name on the corporate lien documents. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to outsmart people who tried to destroy you. The freezing Chicago rain fell like ice against my skin, but it was nothing compared to the coldness spreading through my chest. I stood at the edge of the freshly dug grave, staring down at the polished mahogany casket that held David, my husband. A massive heart attack ripped him away 3 days ago, leaving me a young widow clutching a wet umbrella and a broken future. The true nightmare was not resting beneath the dirt. It was walking right toward me across the wet cemetery grass. I looked up to see my in-laws, Patricia and Richard, marching toward the burial site. They had not answered a single one of my calls since I informed them of their son's death. Yet here they were, traveling all the way from Ohio. Patricia was clutching the arm of a teary-eyed blonde named Rachel. Clinging to Rachel's other hand was a little boy, maybe 5 years old, even through the torrential rain. The resemblance was a physical blow to my stomach. The boy had David's exact jawline. He had David's sharp, piercing blue eyes. "Do not you dare look at him," Patricia hissed, her voice cutting clearly through the quiet hum of the remaining mourners. She stepped forcefully in front of the little boy, shielding him from my view. I stood frozen, damp earth sinking beneath my heels. "Patricia, what is going on?" "Who is this?" Patricia announced, raising her voice so the lingering tech executives and our mutual friends could hear every perfectly enunciated word. "Is Rachel, David's true family. And this is Leo, his only son and rightful heir." Whispers erupted. My colleagues exchanged shocked glances. My hands trembled. I spent 6 years building a life with David. We tried for a baby for 3 years, enduring grueling fertility treatments that drained my physical and emotional reserves, only for him to comfort me with soft kisses, promising that it was just us against the world. While I was injecting myself with hormones, he had been taking frequent investor meetings in Ohio. It was not a startup he was visiting. It was his secret life. Rachel dabbed her eyes perfectly on cue, burying her face into Patricia's shoulder. "He promised me we would finally be together this year," she sobbed loudly. "He promised me he was leaving her. And he did." "Sweetheart," Patricia cooed, glaring at me with unmasked venom. "He left her with nothing, just like she deserves." Before I could even process the magnitude of the betrayal, a tall shadow fell over me. It was Jamal, my sister-in-law Samantha's husband. Jamal was an African-American financial consultant known for aggressive corporate takeovers. A man who wore his arrogance like a tailored suit. He stepped forward, a smug smirk playing on his lips, holding a thick manila envelope protected by a waterproof sleeve. "You are always a bit slow on the uptake, Claire," Jamal said, his voice smooth and patronizing. "David loved you as a comfortable placeholder in Chicago, but Rachel was his high school sweetheart. She gave him the son you could not. And before he passed, he made sure his real legacy was protected." He shoved the envelope into my chest. I grabbed it. "What is this?" I asked, my voice hollow. "That is an updated will," Jamal said. "Dated just 6 months ago and fully notarized in the state of Ohio. David left the entirety of his tech company, the $2 million Chicago estate, and all liquid assets to Leo, with Rachel and his parents acting as the sole conservators of the trust. For years, David's family had treated me like garbage. They thought I was a glorified secretary, a low-level admin girl who got lucky marrying a tech genius. I never bothered to correct their assumptions at holiday dinners. I never bothered to explain that my actual title was Senior Corporate Liquidator. I spent my days dismantling bankrupt corporations, tearing apart balance sheets to find hidden assets and toxic liabilities. I ruined greedy men for a living. But right now, standing in the rain, I was not a liquidator. I was a wife who realized her entire marriage was a meticulously crafted illusion. "You cannot be serious," I whispered, clutching the damp envelope. "He would not do this." "He already did," Samantha chimed in, stepping out from behind Jamal. She looked me up and down with absolute disgust. "You do not belong here anymore. Claire, go back to whatever cheap apartment you crawled out of. You are cut off." Jamal leaned in close. "I reviewed these documents myself. Claire, they are ironclad. You have zero claim to the company, and you have zero claim to the house. Consider this your formal notice. We will be arriving at the Chicago estate on Monday to take inventory. Have bags packed by then." I looked Jamal in the eye. Monday. Got it. I turned around and walked away from my husband's grave, taking the first step into a war they had no idea they had just started. The slow drive back from the cemetery was a blur of flashing traffic lights. My hands gripped the leather steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. The heater blasted warm air, yet I could not stop shivering. The image of David's secret family burned behind my eyelids. Rachel standing there with that calculated look of sorrow. Patricia proudly presenting the grandson she had apparently known about for years. Jamal delivering the ultimate legal ambush right over the open earth of my husband's grave. It was a perfectly orchestrated execution. I did not drive to the $2 million estate I had shared with David. The thought of stepping into that house, seeing his shoes by the door, and the nursery we planned to decorate made my chest physically ache. I needed walls that belonged solely to me. I needed absolute silence. I steered my car toward the downtown financial district, pulling into the underground parking garage of my office building. The weekend security guard nodded as I swiped my badge, allowing me into the empty high-rise. I walked into my suite, turned on the harsh overhead lights, and dropped Jamal's manila envelope onto my glass desk. The grief that paralyzed me an hour ago was rapidly mutating into a cold, clinical focus. I was a woman who dismantled corporate empires. Dissecting a fraudulent life was entirely within my wheelhouse. I smoothed out the damp pages of the will. It was meticulously drafted, clearly bearing the hallmark of Jamal's aggressive financial background. The document named Rachel as the primary guardian of the newly inherited trust. Patricia and Richard held veto power over major asset liquidations. It cleanly excised me from every bank account, every stock option, and the deed to our home. I stared at the signature at the bottom of the page. It was indeed David's signature. I did not need a handwriting expert to tell me it was genuine. The sharp, aggressive slant of the letters was a perfect match. He had planned this. While I was picking out paint colors for a future we would never have, he had been sitting in an Ohio law office systematically stripping away my security to hand it to a woman he kept hidden for half a decade. He gave Jamal the keys to my destruction. My desk phone buzzed, shattering the silence of the empty office. It was my attorney. A sharp-toothed corporate litigator named Harrison. "Claire, I just heard what happened at the cemetery," Harrison said, his voice laced with genuine shock. "The entire tech sector is gossiping about it." "Are you okay?" "I have a copy of the new will in front of me," I replied, my voice eerily calm. Jamal handed it to me in the rain. I heard Harrison exhale sharply. "Listen to me. Claire, do not pack your bags. We are going to contest this immediately. Under state law, a spouse cannot be entirely disinherited from a marital estate regardless of an out-of-state document. We can tie them up in probate court for 5 years. We will freeze the corporate assets, demand a paternity test for the kid, and drag Rachel through the legal mud. I will make their lives a living nightmare." "No," I said. There was a long silence on the line. No. Claire, they are trying to steal your home and your husband's entire company. They ambushed you at a funeral. Harrison, I interrupted, leaning back in my leather chair. Jamal is an arrogant predator. He thinks he has engineered the perfect hostile takeover of my life. If we fight him in probate court, it validates his power. It turns this into a bitter, drawn-out emotional battle over David's legacy. I do not want a battle. I want a slaughter. What are you thinking? Harrison asked, his tone shifting from protective to strictly professional. He knew exactly what I did for a living. He knew that when my voice dropped to this exact pitch, a corporation was about to be bled dry. I need you to pull the primary operating agreements for David's tech firm, I instructed. Pull the tax filings. Pull everything. I want a comprehensive forensic audit of every single ledger, debt, and liability attached to his name. Jamal was so eager to secure the assets that I guarantee he did not run a deep forensic check on the liabilities. You think David was hiding financial trouble? Harrison asked. David was a man who successfully hid an entire family for 5 years, I stated, tracing the signature on the desk. A man capable of that deception is not keeping honest accounting books. He is hiding something massive. And Jamal, blinded by his own greed and his desire to humiliate me, just volunteered to take ownership of it. I will get my paralegals on it right now, Harrison promised. But Claire, you have to be careful. Jamal filed a 48-hour notice of eviction. He is going to try to physically force you out of that house on Monday. Let him, I said smoothly. Let him take the house. Let him take the company. I want them to feel like they have won an absolute, undisputed victory. I want them to get so comfortable on their thrones that they do not notice the floorboards rotting beneath them. After hanging up, I opened my laptop to check my personal accounts. A glaring red notification blinked on the screen. Access denied. Joint account frozen by court order. Jamal had been incredibly busy while I was standing in the rain mourning my husband. He had managed to file an emergency injunction leveraging David's death certificate and the new will to freeze all shared marital assets pending a probate review. The legal ambush was complete. It was brilliant. He was trying to starve me out. He wanted me desperate, broke, and begging for a settlement before the 48 hours were up. I logged into a separate, highly encrypted portal. Jamal, Patricia, and David had always believed I was just a low-level administrative assistant making $40,000 a year. They never bothered to inquire how I funded my own expenses or what my job actually entailed. They did not know that my corporate liquidation bonuses were paid directly into an anonymous offshore limited liability company I established years before I even met David. I had over $3 million in untraceable liquid capital sitting in an account that did not have my name on it. I was not starving. I was heavily armed and ready for war. My cell phone vibrated against the glass desk, pulling my eyes away from the offshore account balance. It was an automated text message from my shared bank account, alerting me of a failed transaction. A subscription payment for David's favorite streaming service had bounced. I stared at the screen, the glaring red text serving as a harsh reminder of my new reality. The man who set up that account with me, the man who held my hand while we chose the passwords, had orchestrated my financial ruin. The grieving widow inside me took her final shuddering breath. In her place, the corporate liquidator woke up. I stood up and walked over to the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city. For 6 years, I had viewed my marriage through the rose-colored glasses of a devoted wife. I trusted David implicitly. Now I forced myself to strip away the emotion and look at our life together as a hostile corporate entity. I needed to perform a forensic audit of my own past. Once I applied my professional methodology to our marriage. The red flags lit up the dark corners of my memory like distress flares. David always claimed his Ohio trips were critical for securing regional investors. He would pack his bags on a Thursday evening, kissing my forehead, and promising to call me from the hotel. The hotel charges always matched his itinerary. The flight receipts were perfectly filed. He was meticulous. But I recalled the times he returned with a faint scent of baby powder or organic laundry detergent. I remembered the random weekend he completely powered down his phone, claiming a massive network outage at the Ohio data center. That was likely the exact weekend Rachel went into labor with Leo. The most sickening realization washed over me as I connected the timeline of Leo's birth to our fertility struggles. 5 years ago, I was injecting myself with hormones, enduring the physical and emotional toll of in vitro fertilization. I cried myself to sleep when the treatments failed. David held me, whispering that we would get through it together. He watched me endure painful procedures, watched me mourn in the children we could not conceive, all while knowing he had a perfectly healthy infant son waiting for him in another state. The sheer level of sociopathic detachment required to play the comforting childless husband while hiding a secret toddler was staggering. And then there were my in-laws, Patricia and Richard. Their sudden change in attitude over the past few years finally made sense. When David and I first married, Patricia was aggressively present, constantly calling and visiting our Chicago home. Then, about 5 years ago, right around the time Leo was born, her visits abruptly stopped. She claimed the travel was becoming too difficult for Richard's back. Instead, David started traveling to them. They had actively harbored their son's second life. They sat at their dining table with Rachel and the boy, celebrating birthdays and holidays while I sat in Chicago believing they were just elderly parents who preferred to stay home. They were accomplices. Jamal and Samantha had played their roles perfectly as well. Samantha always treated me with a thin veneer of condescension, viewing my job as a meaningless administrative role. Jamal, with his aggressive finance background and bespoke suits, thought he was the undisputed apex predator of the family. He viewed me as a fragile, uneducated civilian. He assumed freezing the bank accounts and flashing a legally dense document in my face would break me. He relied on the traditional playbook of overwhelming a grieving widow with complex legal maneuvers and immediate financial starvation. He thought I would panic. He did not realize he had just locked a true apex predator inside the vault. I walked back to my desk and opened a new encrypted file. I titled it Project Demolition. I began typing out every asset, every known associate, and every possible vulnerability tied to David's tech company. If Jamal wanted the keys to the kingdom, I was going to ensure he inherited a poison chalice. My mind raced through the mechanics of corporate liability. A company built by a liar is inherently unstable. David's tech firm appeared successful on paper, boasting a shiny headquarters and a roster of impressive clients. But an operation run by a man juggling 2 distinct lives across state lines requires massive hidden cash flow, the private flights, the second home for Rachel to hush, money likely paid to keep his Ohio life insulated. None of that could be sustained on his stated executive salary alone. David was pulling funds from somewhere. I pulled out a legal pad and started sketching out the corporate structure of his firm. As a founder, he had fiduciary duties. If he was siphoning capital to fund his secret family, he was leaving a paper trail of financial crimes. All I had to do was find the loose thread and pull. The beauty of my profession is that I know exactly where corporate rats hide their stolen cheese. I spent the next 4 hours mapping out a comprehensive strategy. I would not fight the eviction. I would not fight the forged will. By stepping aside and letting Jamal and Patricia seize control of the estate and the company, they would legally assume total responsibility for everything attached to those entities. Under corporate law, when you aggressively assume control of an asset, you also inherit its liabilities. They were so blinded by the shiny facade of David's wealth that they never bothered to check the structural integrity of the foundation. The digital clock on my computer screen blinked 4 o'clock in the morning. Outside, the Chicago rain had finally stopped. The grieving wife who had walked into this office was gone forever. I closed my laptop tightly. Jamal had given me 48 hours to vacate the estate. I was going to use those hours to prepare a trap that would bankrupt their entire bloodline. The morning sun broke through the gray Chicago clouds, casting long, sharp shadows across the glass facade of David's tech headquarters. I pulled into the executive parking garage right at 8 o'clock. I had not slept a single minute. The adrenaline pumping through my veins was cold and highly calibrated. My mind was incredibly sharp. I walked toward the private elevator. When I swiped my badge, the reader flashed a harsh red light. Access denied. I swiped it again. Red light. Before I could try again. The heavy glass doors slid open. 2 security guards stepped out. Behind them, stepping into the morning light with the swagger of a conquering king, was Jamal. Samantha stood beside him wearing a smug mug smile that practically glowed. Jamal adjusted his custom suit, savoring the moment. I told you. Claire, you are completely cut off. Your access to this building, the company accounts, and the executive suites has been permanently revoked. I channeled the exact vulnerability they expected from a grieving widow. Jamal, you cannot do this. I am David's wife. Half of this company belongs to the marital estate. Samantha laughed sharply. You were his wife on paper. Rachel is the mother of his heir. A judge granted us interim executive control over the corporate trust to protect Leo's assets. We are officially acting board members. You are just a trespasser. Jamal stepped closer, holding a folded legal document. I filed an emergency corporate injunction. The court agreed the company needed immediate leadership to prevent instability. They granted me full authorization to assume the role of interim CEO. The arrogance was impressive. Jamal knew absolutely nothing about running a software firm. He just saw a multi-million-dollar valuation and wanted the throne. I need to go upstairs, I said, allowing my voice to tremble. I have personal items in his office. Everything personal will be boxed up and shipped to whatever cheap apartment you rent. Samantha sneered. We are conducting a full inventory today. I looked past them at the security guards. These were men I had greeted every morning for 6 years. They looked at the ground uncomfortable but bound by the legal paperwork. Jamal snapped his fingers. Escort her off the premises. If she tries to access the building again, call the police. The head of security took a hesitant step. Mrs. Reynolds, please. I let my shoulders slump, perfectly executing the posture of a defeated woman. You are stealing my husband's life's work. You are taking everything. Jamal smiled a wide, predatory grin. I am securing my nephew's rightful inheritance from a woman who contributed absolutely nothing to its creation. Now get off my property. I turned and began walking toward the main lobby exit. Jamal and Samantha followed closely behind. They wanted a spectacle. As we walked through the sprawling lobby, the lively chatter of the software engineers abruptly died down. Dozens of employees stopped in their tracks, holding their coffee cups, staring in shock as their late founder's wife was escorted toward the revolving doors like a criminal. I saw the head of human resources standing near the security desk. She looked absolutely horrified, her hand covering her mouth as Samantha glared at her. Nobody dared to intervene. They all knew their paychecks now depended on the arrogant man leading the charge. I kept my head bowed. I wanted the employees to see a devastated widow. I wanted Jamal to feel the intoxicating rush of absolute power. When a predator feels invincible, they stop checking their blind spots. Revoke her parking validation immediately, Samantha announced to the receptionist. We do not subsidize non-employees. I pushed through the revolving doors onto the Chicago sidewalk. Jamal stood proudly on the other side of the glass, giving me a final mocking salute before turning his back and walking away. I stood on the pavement for 60 seconds, letting the wind hit my face. My performance was over. The trembling stopped. My posture straightened. I pulled my phone from my pocket and dialed Harrison's secure line. He answered on the first ring. Are you in the building I just got thrown out? I replied, my voice brisk and sharp. Jamal secured an emergency injunction for interim executive control. He just claimed the title of acting CEO in front of the entire lobby. Harrison chuckled darkly. He actually took the title. Kiki. He assumed the executive seat before auditing the corporate liabilities. He practically sprinted to the throne. I confirmed. He wants the glory. He wants to sit behind David's desk and play the corporate titan. He just formally and legally tied himself to the company's operational responsibilities. The idiot put his head in the noose, Harrison said. I have my forensic team ripping through the filings right now. We already found discrepancies in the offshore vendor payments. It is bad. Claire, it is worse than we thought. Keep digging. I instructed, walking purposefully toward the corner intersection to hail a cab. I need the exact numbers. I need to know how deep this hole goes before I push Jamal into it. Do not file any contest to the injunction. Let him have total undisputed control. Understood, Harrison replied. What is your next move? They are coming to the house this afternoon to evict me and take inventory of the residential assets, I said, flagging down a passing taxi. I need to prepare the staging ground. I am going to give them the keys to the castle. I slid into the back of the cab and gave the driver the address to the $2 million estate I had shared with a ghost. Jamal and Samantha thought they had completely neutralized me. They thought I was a helpless administrative girl who would shrink away into the night. They had no idea by seizing David's company. They had just handcuffed themselves to a sinking ship. And I was the one holding the explosives to blow a hole in the hull. The cab dropped me off at the edge of the sprawling circular driveway. The estate loomed before me, a massive stone structure that felt entirely foreign. I unlocked the front door and stepped into the grand foyer. The silence of the empty house was immediately shattered by the relentless buzzing of my cell phone. It was not Harrison with a legal update. It was a rapid, unending stream of social media notifications. I pulled the phone from my coat pocket and looked at the screen. The notifications were multiplying by the second. Direct messages, tags, comments, and alerts from people I had not spoken to in years. I opened my social application and found the source of the digital avalanche. Rachel had now gone entirely public. She did not just post a simple announcement. She launched a highly coordinated, weaponized smear campaign designed to obliterate my reputation before I could even formulate a defense. Rachel had created a public tribute page for David, accompanied by a lengthy, tear-stained narrative. The post featured a beautifully curated photo album. There was David holding a newborn Leo in a hospital room. There was David blowing out candles on a birthday cake with Rachel leaning against his shoulder. There was David teaching the little boy how to ride a bicycle in a sunny Ohio park. The visual evidence was devastating, specifically selected to present them as the picture-perfect American family disrupted by tragedy. But the photos were nothing compared to the text. Rachel spun a masterful tale of star-crossed lovers. She claimed she and David were high school sweethearts who never stopped loving each other. According to her post, David made a foolish mistake marrying me during a brief period when they were separated. She painted me as a manipulative, money-hungry opportunist who trapped a brilliant tech founder in a loveless marriage. She claimed David stayed with me only because I threatened to ruin his company and his reputation if he ever tried to leave. She wrote that David desperately wanted to bring his true family to Chicago, but I held him hostage financially. The narrative was entirely fabricated, completely reversing the roles of victim and predator. Rachel portrayed herself as the patient, supportive mother waiting in the wings, while I was the wicked warden keeping a father away from his only son. She concluded the post by announcing that David finally found the courage to update his will before his tragic death, ensuring that his true family would inherit his legacy despite my alleged attempts to steal it all. The reaction was immediate and brutal. Jamal mobilized his own network to amplify the post, sharing it across business platforms and social circles. Samantha was in the comments validating every single lie. She wrote paragraphs about how the family always knew I was a toxic presence, how I isolated David from his parents, and how relieved they were that Rachel and Leo were finally getting justice. I watched in real time as my entire social support system collapsed. The mutual friends I shared with David, the couples we hosted for dinner parties, the wives I went to brunch with, they all turned on me with terrifying speed. People love a scandal, especially when it involves a wealthy widow falling from grace. The hateful comments piled up. Acquaintances called me a gold digger. Complete strangers demanded I be investigated for fraud. My phone vibrated with a direct message from my closest friend, a woman I had known for 4 years. I opened the message expecting a lifeline. Instead, I read a cold, sharp dismissal. She asked how I could possibly keep a father away from his child for 5 years. Before I could even type a response, the application notified me that I had been blocked. Another message arrived from a woman who sat next to me at David's holiday party. She told me I was a monster for trying to steal a little boy's inheritance. Then she blocked me. Within 2 hours, I was completely isolated. Jamal and Rachel executed a flawless character assassination. In the corporate world, destroying an opponent's credibility is the first step in a hostile takeover. If nobody trusted me, nobody would believe me if I cried foul about the forged will or the illegal seizure of the company. Any defense I mounted would simply be viewed as the desperate thrashing of a greedy woman caught in a lie. They successfully shifted the entire narrative, making themselves the heroes taking back a stolen empire. I stood in the center of the vast, quiet living room holding the phone in my hand. A normal person would have crumbled. A normal widow would have taken to the internet frantically typing out defenses, posting screenshots of happy marriage photos, begging people to believe the truth. But engaging in a public mudslinging match is exactly what Jamal wanted. He wanted me distracted by public opinion while he solidified his grip on the actual assets. I did not type a single defense. I did not shed a single tear. I calmly took screenshots of every post, every comment from Samantha, and every bold claim Jamal made sharing the article. I archived the entire smear campaign into my encrypted project folder. In the world of corporate litigation, public defamation is a valuable currency. They were handing me actionable evidence of malicious intent on a silver platter. They were documenting their own arrogance perfectly. Let them have the sympathy of the internet. Let them bask in the support of comments and the digital applause. I did not need followers. I needed leverage. And while Rachel was busy managing her newfound internet fame, I was quietly preparing to sever the financial arteries of the very empire she thought she'd just inherited. The 48-hour clock was ticking rapidly. Jamal was coming for the house tomorrow. It was time to set the stage for my strategic surrender and let the real games finally begin. I walked into the master bedroom and began pulling empty suitcases from the top shelf of the walk-in closet. If I was going to play the role of the defeated, financially ruined widow, I needed the props to match the performance. I grabbed a stack of basic, unremarkable clothing, leaving the designer suits and expensive jewelry untouched. As I folded a plain gray sweater, my phone vibrated on the mattress. It was an automated alert from the bank that held my primary checking account. The message was brief, stating that my debit card had been declined for a recurring utility payment. A second notification immediately followed from my secondary credit card provider. Account suspended pending legal review. I picked up the phone and dialed Harrison. He answered with the heavy sigh of a lawyer who had just spent the last hour fighting a losing battle with a clerk. Jamal did not just file an injunction for the company, Harrison said, his voice tight with frustration. He went nuclear. I just received copies of the filings from an Ohio county judge. Jamal managed to secure an ex parte emergency order freezing every single financial asset tied to David's social security number. Checking accounts, savings accounts, the mortgage escrow, even the joint credit cards you hold together. He locked down everything. An ex parte order means a judge granted the request without giving me a chance to defend myself. I walked over to the nightstand and sat on the edge of the bed. On what grounds did a judge sign off on freezing my personal grocery money? He claimed you are a severe flight risk, Harrison explained. Jamal submitted an affidavit swearing that you were actively attempting to liquidate corporate assets and wire the funds offshore, because David's name was listed as the primary account holder on your joint finances. The judge granted a temporary freeze to prevent asset dissipation until the probate hearing. It is a completely shady legal maneuver. Claire, he definitely used a friendly judge in his local jurisdiction to push this through without standard oversight. The paperwork is full of holes, but untangling it will take at least 30 days. 30 days of absolute financial starvation. That was Jamal's strategy. He knew that contesting a forged will and fighting a hostile corporate takeover required high-powered, expensive litigation. By cutting off my access to the joint funds, he assumed he was cutting off my ability to pay Harrison. He wanted me desperate, broke, and unable to afford a taxi, let alone a protracted legal battle. He expected me to panic and settle for pennies on the dollar just to survive the month. I remembered the day David and I opened those joint accounts. We had just returned from our honeymoon. David sat next to me at the bank manager's desk holding my hand and insisting that he handle all the primary financial responsibilities. He told me I worked too hard at my administrative job and that he wanted to take the stress of managing household bills off my shoulders. I thought he was being a devoted, protective husband. Now, looking back through the lens of a corporate liquidator, I realized he was systematically ensuring I had zero financial autonomy. He was building a cage disguised as a safety net. Claire, are you there? Harrison asked, his voice pulling me back to the present. I can file an emergency counter motion tomorrow morning. I can request a living allowance be released to you from the frozen funds. We can fight this freeze. Absolutely not, I instructed. Do not file any counter motions. Do not ask for a living allowance. If Jamal wants to play the role of the ruthless conqueror, we are going to let him believe his siege was a total success. Harrison sounded thoroughly confused. Claire, how are you going to buy groceries? How are you going to pay for a hotel when they kick you out of the house tomorrow? You cannot fight a war on an empty stomach. I am not hungry. Harrison, I replied. Jamal froze the accounts tied to David's name. He froze the accounts he knew about. He has absolutely no idea that my corporate liquidation bonuses have been flowing into an anonymous limited liability company for the last 7 years. Apex Holdings is fully funded, entirely untraceable, and sitting on over $3 million in liquid capital. My personal war chest is completely untouched. I heard Harrison chuckle a low, appreciative sound. You are a terrifying woman. Claire, I need Jamal to believe his trap worked flawlessly. I continued. I need him feeling arrogant and invincible. A confident enemy is a sloppy enemy. I am going to give him the exact reaction he is waiting for. I hung up the phone and took a deep breath, preparing myself for the next phase of the performance. I navigated to my contacts and dialed Jamal's number. It rang 3 times before he answered. Claire, Jamal said, his voice dripping with condescension. I am surprised you are calling me. I assumed you would be busy packing your bags. Jamal, I said, forcing my voice to tremble. I injected a raw, desperate edge into my tone, breathing heavily as if I were on the verge of a panic attack. My card just declined at the grocery store. The bank said my accounts are frozen. I cannot even buy food. You cannot do this. You have to lift the freeze. Jamal let out a slow, satisfied laugh. The sound echoed through the phone, thick with malice. I warned you at the cemetery. Claire, you are cut off. The court agrees that Leo's inheritance needs to be protected from a woman who clearly has no respect for David's final wishes. Please, I begged, letting a sob hitch in my throat. I have nothing. I cannot even afford a hotel room for tomorrow. Where am I supposed to go? You are leaving me with absolutely nothing. That sounds like a personal problem, Jamal replied coldly. You should have planned your life better instead of relying on a man who clearly did not want you. Be out of the house by noon tomorrow. If you leave quietly and do not cause a scene, I might consider giving you a few $100s from petty cash to cover a bus ticket. But if you try to fight me, I will make sure you are living on the street. Do you understand me? I understand, I whispered, sounding utterly broken. Good girl. Jamal mocked and the line went dead. I pulled the phone away from my ear and smiled. The trembling vanished instantly. The desperation evaporated, replaced by a cold, calculating thrill. Jamal had taken the bait completely. He truly believed he had stripped me of all my resources. He believed he had cornered a helpless, naive administrative assistant. He was so focused on executing his hostile takeover that he failed to secure his own perimeter. By freezing the marital accounts through an Ohio judge, he had legally documented his aggressive control over the estate. He was leaving a paper trail of his financial dominion, a trail that would make him legally liable for everything hidden in David's corporate closet. I walked back to the closet and finished throwing my plainest, cheapest clothes into a single suitcase. I left my expensive coats, my designer shoes, and the jewelry David had given me sitting in their display cases. A truly desperate, terrified woman running from an eviction would not have the presence of mind to pack her valuables. She would grab the bare minimum and flee. I intended to leave this house looking exactly like the victim they created. Tomorrow at noon, Jamal and Samantha would arrive to claim their prize. They would strut through the front doors, taking inventory of the expensive furniture and the artwork celebrating their victory over the woman they despised. They would push me out into the cold, completely unaware that I was already executing a financial maneuver that would strip them of everything they owned. The board was set. The pieces were moving exactly as I commanded. The next morning arrived with a biting chill that seeped through the grand windows of the estate. I woke up on top of the covers of the guest bed, fully dressed in the cheap gray sweater and faded jeans I had selected the night before. I did not bother applying makeup. I pulled my hair into a messy, uneven knot at the base of my neck. I saw exactly what Jamal and Samantha expected. A shattered, exhausted woman who had given up. Before they arrived, I had one final call to make. I dialed Harrison. He answered with the sharp, rapid energy of a litigator ready to go to war. I have the counter motions ready, Claire Harrison announced. I can have a courier at the courthouse in 20 minutes. We can challenge the freeze and slap an injunction on Jamal immediately. Stand down, I commanded, my voice dropping back into the cold, authoritative register of my profession. Do not file a single paper. Harrison, do not call the courthouse. You are going to do absolutely nothing. Harrison sighed heavily. Claire, you are handing them the keys to an estate and a tech company. Letting this eviction notice expire without a challenge validates their authority. You are legally acknowledging Jamal as interim CEO. It sets a dangerous precedent. That is the point, I explained. I want them to have undisputed authority. Corporate law is clear. Harrison, when an individual aggressively assumes executive control of a company without due diligence, they also assume full legal and financial responsibility for its liabilities. Jamal is using a forged will to bypass probate and seize David's empire. By stepping aside, I am letting him hold a ticking time bomb. Harrison paused, his legal mind working through the mechanics of my trap. You want them to take the liability. Harrison realized his tone shifting from frantic to deeply impressed. You want Jamal to sign his name on the dotted line, officially binding himself to whatever massive debt David was hiding. Exactly, I said. Jamal thinks he is the smartest man in the room. He is so focused on stealing my wealth for Rachel's son that he is ignoring the rules of corporate acquisition. He thinks he is stealing a gold mine. I need him to lock the doors before he realizes it is a toxic dump. Filing a motion today disrupts his momentum and gives him a reason to review the books. I need him fueled by greed. Tell your accounting team to keep digging into David's ledgers. Find the exact debt amount, but legally stand down. Understood, Harrison said, his voice now laced with a dangerous thrill. We will let them claim the throne. Call me when you are out of the house. I ended the call and walked down the grand staircase to the foyer, dragging my scuffed suitcase behind me. The wheels clattered loudly against the marble tile. I positioned myself near the front door and waited. I practiced my breathing, making my chest heave, forcing my eyes to stay wide and watery. At noon, a black SUV pulled into the driveway. The front door swung open and Jamal walked in without knocking. He wore a sharp suit radiating absolute dominance. Samantha followed close behind, wearing a victorious sneer. She looked around the beautiful space as if I were a pest she had just hired someone to exterminate. Right on time, Jamal said, checking his expensive watch. I am glad to see you decided to be reasonable, Claire. It makes this transition much easier for everyone. I let out a ragged, trembling breath. I shrank back against the wall, clutching the handle of my cheap suitcase. Where am I supposed to go? I asked, my voice cracking perfectly on the last word. You took my home. You took my money. I have nothing left. Jamal. Samantha laughed, a cruel sound echoing off the high ceilings. Stop the waterworks, Claire. You never belonged here anyway. David only kept you around because it was convenient, now that his real son is provided for. You can go back to being a nobody. You should be grateful we are not charging rent for the years you lived here. I stared at the floor, biting my lip to force a tear to spill over my eyelashes. Please, I whispered, sounding thoroughly crushed. I just lost my husband. Can you at least give me a few days to figure out a hotel I cannot access my accounts? I cannot even afford a meal. Jamal stepped closer, towering over me. His dark eyes were cold, devoid of any human empathy. He pulled a crisp $50 bill from his money clip and let it flutter to the marble floor at my feet. Take a bus, Jamal ordered. You are no longer part of this family, Claire. The company belongs to Leo. The estate belongs to the trust. I am the acting CEO, and I want you off my property before I have you arrested for trespassing. Do not try to fight us in court. You do not have the resources, the intelligence, or the stamina to take me on. I slowly bent down and picked up the $50 bill with trembling fingers. I looked up at him with wide, defeated eyes. I will not fight you, I surrendered, letting a sob tear from my throat. Just please leave me alone. I will sign whatever you want. I just want this nightmare to end. Jamal smirked, completely satisfied with his absolute victory. We will send the final relinquishment papers to your lawyer next week. Now get out. I grabbed my suitcase, kept my head bowed, and walked out the front doors into the brisk Chicago air. I did not look back. I shuffled down the driveway, playing the broken widow, until I rounded the corner and disappeared from their sight. Then I stopped. I stood up straight. I brushed the dust off my jeans and tucked the $50 bill into my pocket. The tears vanished, replaced by a cold, calculating grin. They had taken the bait completely. The trap was set. The door was locked. And Jamal had just handed me the match to burn their entire lives to the ground. I walked 2 blocks down the leafy suburban street until I reached a busy intersection. I hailed a rideshare using a secure prepaid phone I kept exclusively for corporate investigations. I directed the driver to a luxury corporate high-rise downtown. 2 years ago, I signed a long-term lease on a sprawling penthouse suite under the name Apex Holdings. David never knew it existed. It was my professional command center, completely insulated from the marital estate and completely untraceable. I entered the suite, the heavy biometric locks clicking securely shut behind me. The space was sleek, minimalist, and dominated by a custom-built server rack and a desk with 4 curved monitors. I tossed the cheap suitcase into a corner and threw the gray sweater in the trash. I poured myself a large glass of expensive scotch, tied my hair into a tight professional knot, and sat down at my terminal. The act was over. It was time to dissect my dead husband. David was a software engineer, which meant he believed he was smarter than everyone else. That arrogance always breeds predictable security flaws. He used military-grade encryption for his external client portals, but for his personal shadow ledgers, he used variations of the same encryption key he created during his college days. A key I had watched him physically type 1,000 times when he thought I was just blindly staring at his screen. I booted up my decryption software, input the base strings, and let the algorithm hammer against his secure private cloud server, while the brute force program ran. I reviewed the preliminary data Harrison had forwarded from the public corporate filings. David's tech company, Zenith Solutions, looked spectacular on the surface. They boasted sleek offices, high-profile enterprise clients, and a steady stream of positive press. But as a corporate liquidator, I do not look at press releases. I look at cash flow. I look at accounts payable. I directly trace the money. The public ledgers showed a massive spike in operational expenses over the past 36 months. There were payments to unverified consulting groups in Ohio, mysterious licensing fees, and inflated marketing budgets. David was siphoning capital right out of his own venture to maintain Rachel's lifestyle and keep his parents completely silent. A sharp chime from my computer broke the silence of the penthouse. The custom decryption algorithm had successfully bypassed David's primary firewall. I was inside the belly of the beast. I opened the main directory, my eyes rapidly scanning the hidden folders. He had named the primary drive project Horizon, a poetic name for a truly disgusting reality. I bypassed the personal photos and communication logs entirely. I did not care about his love letters to Rachel or his arrogant communications with Jamal. I only cared about the pure math. I opened the master financial spreadsheets. These were the real books, the ones he intentionally hid from the Internal Revenue Service and his own board of directors. My fingers flew across the keyboard running pivot tables and cross-referencing his hidden offshore transfers against the company's stated revenue. The numbers were moving so fast, but my mind processed them with absolute clarity. The sheer volume of cash he was burning was staggering. Rachel's lifestyle was not just expensive, it was entirely parasitic. He had purchased her a sprawling estate in Ohio, fully staffed alongside luxury vehicles and a massive trust fund for Leo. To sustain that extreme level of hemorrhaging cash, David had to cross a fatal line. A company with that much overhead cannot simply fake consulting fees forever. The board would eventually demand a rigorous audit of the company finances. The investors would eventually want a massive return on their initial capital. He had to be patching the bleeding holes with something else entirely. Something highly illegal. I dug deeper into a secure folder locked behind a secondary biometric wall. I easily bypassed it using a custom backdoor script I actively utilized during hostile takeovers of corrupted tech startups. The screen flooded with raw banking data. My breath caught in my throat. I leaned closer to the monitor, the blue light illuminating the cold satisfaction spreading across my face. David had not just been skimming profits to fund his double life. He had been actively stealing from his own corporate tax escrow. He had stopped paying federal payroll taxes for his hundreds of employees nearly 3 years ago. Instead of sending the money to the government, he routed it through a maze of dummy shell companies directly into his Ohio accounts. The severe financial penalties, the massive compounded interest, the sheer scale of the federal crime was absolutely breathtaking. And Jamal, the supposedly brilliant, highly aggressive financial consultant, had completely missed it. He was so desperate to seize the CEO title and legally claimed the $2 million Chicago house that he bypassed basic standard corporate due diligence. He did not hire an independent auditor. He just forged a will and blindly grabbed the steering wheel. By formally declaring himself the interim CEO and officially assuming executive control of Zenith Solutions, Jamal had just legally volunteered to take the fall. The federal government does not care about messy family drama. They care exclusively about who is sitting in the executive chair when the music stops playing. But David's federal tax fraud was just the beginning. The numbers still did not balance perfectly. Even with the stolen tax funds, David was still falling severely short. He needed a massive immediate injection of untraceable cash to keep the entire house of cards from collapsing before his sudden death. I pulled up the liabilities ledger, my eyes scanning the heavily encrypted debt schedules. He took out a loan, a massive, totally unregulated, incredibly dangerous, toxic loan, and he used personal collateral to secure it. I clicked open the final encrypted folder, fully ready to see exactly who David had sold his soul to. The screen flashed green as the final decryption protocol finished its brutal work. A scanned digital document loaded into the secure viewer. I leaned closer to the monitor, staring at the corporate letterhead. It was not a traditional banking institution. The logo belonged to a private equity syndicate that operated entirely in the unregulated shadows of corporate finance. They specialized in predatory lending, offering massive injections of fast capital to desperate founders at extortionate interest rates. I knew this firm perfectly. I had dismantled 3 of their victim companies over the past 4 years. They were ruthless, but their contracts were always a masterpiece of aggressive legal leverage. I scrolled down to the principal amount. $5 million. David had taken out a $5 million toxic corporate loan just 8 months ago. The terms were absolutely suicidal. The interest rate was a staggering 30% compounded monthly, but the true poison was hidden in the covenants. It was a strict mezzanine debt structure with an aggressive acceleration clause. If Zenith Solutions missed a single payment, the lender had the legal right to demand the entire $5 million principal immediately. If the company could not pay, the lender was authorized to bypass probate and seize all corporate assets, intellectual property, and operational accounts. David had literally signed away the company to buy himself a few more months of pretending to be a successful tech titan. He needed that $5 million to keep the server farms running and the payroll clearing while he funneled every other spare cent into Rachel's luxurious Ohio lifestyle. I pulled up the corporate balance sheet and overlaid it with the loan amortization schedule. The truth was glaringly obvious. Zenith Solutions was a completely hollow shell. The entire company was a magnificent optical illusion. The expensive downtown Chicago lease, the catered employee lunches, the flashy marketing campaigns. It was all a desperately painted facade covering a massive financial sinkhole. There was no actual revenue supporting the operation. David had been burning through investor capital and this toxic $5 million loan just to maintain the appearance of a thriving business. He built an empire out of paper and gasoline, and then he died right before someone struck a match. But the toxic loan was not even the most dangerous explosive hidden in the server. I minimized the loan document and maximized the hidden payroll ledgers I had uncovered earlier. I needed to trace the exact mechanics of the $8 million federal tax evasion scheme. The audacity of what David had done was genuinely staggering. He had not simply failed to pay corporate taxes. He had committed direct systematic fraud against his own employees and the federal government. Every 2 weeks, Zenith Solutions issued paychecks to its hundreds of software engineers, sales representatives, and administrative staff. Those paychecks showed the standard federal and state tax withholdings deducted from their gross pay. The employees reasonably believed their taxes were being responsibly remitted to the Internal Revenue Service. They were deeply mistaken. David had engineered a shadow routing protocol within the accounting software. The money withheld from the employees was quietly diverted into a series of dummy accounts registered to obscure shell entities in Ohio. instead of paying the federal government $8 million over the course of 3 years. David stole the withheld taxes to purchase Rachel's sprawling estate fund, Leo's private trust, and buy the expensive sports cars parked in their driveway. Stealing employee tax withholdings is not a standard civil violation. It is a massive federal felony. The Internal Revenue Service does not negotiate when it comes to stolen payroll taxes. They investigate, they penalize, and they pierce the corporate veil to hold the acting executives personally liable for the stolen funds. This was the magnificent trap Jamal had just blindly vaulted into. In corporate law, whoever occupies the executive chair when the music stops is the one forced to face the music. By marching into the lobby, flashing his forged will, and securing an emergency court order to declare himself the acting chief executive officer of Zenith Solutions. Jamal had formally assumed the fiduciary duties of the company. He wanted the power, the prestige, and the $2 million house. He wanted to parade around Chicago as a conquering financial consultant. But by aggressively taking legal control of the entity, he had legally chained himself to the $8 million federal tax liability and the $5 million toxic loan. He bypassed standard due diligence because he was entirely blinded by greed and his arrogant desire to humiliate me. If Jamal had simply hired an independent auditor to review the books before filing his emergency injunction, he would have seen the massive irregularities. He would have walked away from the smoking crater of David's legacy. But Jamal viewed me as an uneducated civilian. He thought the only obstacle between him and immense wealth was a grieving widow who could be easily terrified by frozen bank accounts and an eviction notice. He spent his energy securing an Ohio judge to lock down my grocery money, completely failing to secure his own corporate perimeter. He assumed he was stealing a gold mine. He had absolutely no idea he had just broken into a burning building and proudly locked the doors from the inside. I sat back in my leather chair, taking a slow sip of my scotch. The burning sensation in my throat matched the cold, mechanical joy radiating through my chest. There were no tears left for David. The man I married was a complete fiction, a sociopathic narcissist who destroyed our financial future to fund his deception. The grief was entirely gone, replaced by the precise calculating energy of my profession. I looked at the calendar on my monitor. The next payment for the $5 million toxic loan was due in exactly 5 days. When that payment inevitably bounced, the private equity firm would trigger the acceleration clause and demand the entire principal. At the exact same time, the end of the fiscal quarter was approaching, meaning the Internal Revenue Service automated auditing systems would soon flag the missing $8 million in payroll taxes. The federal government and ruthless private equity predators were about to converge on Zenith Solutions simultaneously. Jamal and Patricia thought they had won the ultimate victory. They thought they had left me with absolutely nothing. They were currently sleeping soundly, dreaming of their newly stolen empire, entirely oblivious to the catastrophic financial avalanche hovering directly above their heads. The math was perfect. The destruction was guaranteed. Now, I just needed to secure my own position as the ultimate predator in this corporate ecosystem. I opened the collateral annex of the loan agreement. Private equity firms operating in the unregulated shadows do not lend $5 million to a struggling software company on good faith alone. They demand blood. They demand hard, tangible assets. They require an ironclad guarantee that if the cash flow completely stops, they can legally strip the founders of everything they own. I needed to see exactly what David had offered them to secure that massive injection of capital. I scrolled through the first page of the asset schedule. The first item listed was the Chicago estate. David had forged my signature on a quitclaim deed to use our marital home as the primary collateral. I felt a brief flash of disgust at the blatant forgery, but I quickly suppressed it. The house was already gone in my mind. Jamal and Samantha could enjoy the grand staircase and the marble foyer for a few more weeks. It did not matter, but a $5 million high-risk loan required significantly more backing than a $2 million house with an existing mortgage. I scrolled further down the highly encrypted digital page to schedule B real estate assets. The address leaped off the screen. A sprawling 6-bedroom property in a wealthy suburb of Columbus, Ohio. The primary residence of Patricia and Richard. The house where David grew up. The house where they had been proudly hosting Rachel and Leo behind my back, celebrating holidays and birthdays while I was sitting alone in Chicago. My fingers hovered over the keyboard as I processed the sheer magnitude of David's betrayal against his own bloodline. He had not just lied to me. He had quietly mortgaged his parents' entire retirement security to keep his fraudulent tech empire afloat. I pulled up the appended guarantor signatures. There it was. Richard's distinct looping handwriting on a corporate surety bond. David must have slipped the document into a stack of routine tax paperwork years ago, leveraging his father's absolute blind faith in his genius son. Richard signed away his home without ever reading the fine print. But the list of collateral did not stop there. I scrolled to Schedule C. Another property address, this one located in an exclusive gated community in Atlanta, Georgia, the primary residence of Jamal and Samantha. I actually laughed aloud. The sound was sharp and metallic in the empty penthouse. Jamal, the aggressive African-American financial consultant. The man who prided himself on tearing apart balance sheets and intimidating weaker opponents, had been completely played by his own brother-in-law. Years ago, when David was seeking initial seed capital for Zenith Solutions, Jamal had enthusiastically joined the board as an early advisory partner. It was a vanity title, a way for Jamal to brag at expensive country clubs about his high-level involvement in a hot tech startup. But that vanity title came with standard corporate guarantor paperwork. David kept those blank guarantor forms sitting in a secure drawer for 5 years. When the toxic shadow lenders demanded more collateral for the $5 million emergency injection, David simply attached Jamal's previously signed advisory agreements to the debt schedule. He cross-collateralized Jamal's luxury Atlanta estate without making a single phone call. The absolute brutal poetry of the situation was staggering. Jamal marched into the Chicago cemetery and shoved a forged will into my chest, desperate to steal a company that was secretly preparing to foreclose on his own home. He locked me out of the corporate headquarters, legally declaring himself the interim chief executive officer, essentially validating all the prior corporate debt structures. By aggressively verifying the company operations in probate court to secure Leo's inheritance, Jamal legally cemented the toxic loan validity. He had locked his own front door from the outside and happily handed the key to a ruthless shadow lender. If the loan defaulted, the private equity firm would not waste time dragging a dead man's empty through bankruptcy court. They would execute the acceleration clause and immediately seize the hard assets listed in the collateral schedules. They would seize the Chicago estate. They would seize Patricia and Richard's retirement home in Ohio. They would seize Jamal and Samantha's Atlanta mansion. David had built a massive financial bomb, tied his entire family to it, and died before the timer hit 0. Then Jamal, in his infinite arrogance, ran into the room and hugged the bomb, intentionally pushing me out of the blast radius. I leaned back in my leather chair and stared at the 4 glowing monitors. The Ohio family wanted David's legacy. They wanted the wealth, the prestige, and the unearned power. They believed they had utterly destroyed a weak, naive widow. They believed they were the untouchable royalty of this twisted narrative protected by a forged will and an aggressive smear campaign. But I knew the rules of corporate slaughter better than anyone. A toxic loan held by an aggressive private equity syndicate is a blunt instrument. It destroys indiscriminately. If I left the loan in the hands of the shadow lenders, they would liquidate the family properties and take the massive profit for themselves. They would be the ones to crush Patricia and Jamal. I did not want anonymous bankers taking the profit. I wanted to hold the leash. I wanted to be the one who knocked on their front doors with the foreclosure notices in hand. I wanted to look Jamal directly in the eye when he realized the woman he threw onto the street was legally seizing his mansion. To execute that level of absolute vengeance, I could not just sit back and watch the company implode. I needed to own the implosion. I needed to control the debt. I pulled up my secure banking portal and checked the balance of Apex Holdings. $3, $2 million in untraceable. Perfectly clean capital. It was not enough to pay off a $5 million loan. But in the high-stakes world of distressed corporate debt, you never pay full price. Shadow lenders hate risk. They deal in fast liquid capital. When a corporate founder dies unexpectedly, any outstanding loan immediately gets flagged as highly distressed. The private equity firm holding David's note was likely already panicking behind closed doors. They were looking at a dead chief executive officer, a messy probate battle, and a potentially drawn-out legal fight to seize residential collateral across 3 different state lines. They wanted out. They would gladly sell that toxic debt for pennies on the dollar to anyone willing to assume the massive headache of collection. I was going to be their perfect buyer. I was going to purchase the heavy steel chains that bound my in-laws and hold the keys securely in my own hand. The legal ambush they initiated at the cemetery was about to be met with a corporate execution. I picked up my secure phone and scrolled through my encrypted contact list. I needed a proxy. I could not approach the private equity firm directly. If they saw David's widow trying to buy his toxic debt, they would immediately smell blood in the water. They would raise the price, assuming I was acting out of desperate sentimentality to save my husband's legacy. I needed them to believe they were dealing with a faceless, ruthless corporate vulture who only cared about stripping the copper wire out of a burning building. I tapped the name Donovan Cross. Donovan was a senior distressed debt broker based in Manhattan. We had collaborated on a dozen high-profile liquidations over the past decade. He was a shark in a tailored suit, a man who negotiated massive asset transfers before his morning coffee. He answered on the second ring. "Claire Donovan," said his voice sharp and alert. "I saw the news about David. My condolences. I assume this is not a social call. I am liquidating Zenith Solutions," I stated flatly. "I need you to act as my broker." Donovan paused. "Your husband's firm. The industry chatter says his brother-in-law just filed an injunction to seize control. The street thinks the company is a gold mine." "Why are you liquidating?" "Because the street is looking at a mirage," I explained. David was running a shadow ledger. He took out a $5 million mezzanine loan from Obsidian Credit 8 months ago. The company is completely hollow. Jamal, the brother-in-law, just assumed executive control without running a forensic audit. He legally chained himself to the sinking ship. Donovan let out a low whistle. Obsidian Credit. Those guys are absolute butchers. They hold paper with immediate acceleration clauses. If David is dead, they are already panicking about a protracted probate battle over the collateral. "Exactly," I said. "They want out. They want fast liquidity to cover their exposure. I want you to reach out to Obsidian today. Tell them you represent a private entity called Apex Holdings. Offer to buy the entire $5 million debt portfolio, including all attached collateral covenants. But offer them a fraction of the value. Play hardball. Remind them that collecting from a dead founder's messy state across 3 state lines will take years." Donovan understood the assignment perfectly. He knew how to leverage fear in the financial markets. Obsidian Credit was currently staring at a $5 million black hole. By offering them a clean, immediate exit, we were doing them a favor. I stayed on the secure line while Donovan initiated a conference call with the managing partners at Obsidian. I muted my microphone, listening silently as the transaction unfolded. The executives at Obsidian were furious, defensive, and ultimately desperate. Donovan was masterful. He casually highlighted every single risk factor. He mentioned David's sudden death. He mentioned the potential instability of interim leadership. He painted a picture of endless litigation and depreciating assets. My client, Apex Holdings, is willing to take this toxic asset off your books today, Donovan pitched smoothly. We will assume the collection risk. We will assume the legal friction. We are offering $1.2 million for the entire portfolio. Cash transfer within 2 hours. The Obsidian executives scoffed at the initial offer. They demanded $3 million. Donovan countered with 1.5. The negotiation was a brutal, rapid-fire exchange of financial threats and risk assessments. I sat in my penthouse watching the city traffic below, feeling a profound sense of control. This was my arena. After 40 minutes of aggressive haggling, Obsidian Credit caved. The final purchase price was agreed upon at $1.8 million. I was buying absolute dominion over my husband's entire family for less than $2 million. Send the transfer protocols to the holding account. Donovan instructed the executives. He ended the conference call and clicked back over to my line. The paper is yours. Claire. $1.8 million. They are drafting the assignment of debt right now. Apex Holdings is about to become the primary secured creditor for Zenith Solutions. You earned your commission today. Donovan. I said, a rare, genuine smile touching my lips. Keep the transaction absolutely quiet. I do not want the new executive team at Zenith knowing their debt just changed hands. They need to discover it on my schedule. I opened the offshore banking portal for Apex Holdings. I initiated the wire transfer of $1.8 million directly to Obsidian Credit. The progress bar loaded quickly. When the screen flashed green confirming the transaction, a wave of cold satisfaction rushed through my veins. The deed was done. The private equity firm released their claim. Apex Holdings officially owned the $5 million note. I immediately downloaded the newly assigned debt schedules. I was now the legal owner of the lien on the Chicago estate. I was the legal owner of the lien on Patricia and Richard's retirement property in Ohio. I was the legal owner of the lien on Jamal and Samantha's luxury mansion in Atlanta. The power dynamic had shifted so violently that the shockwaves simply had not reached them yet. Jamal was currently sitting in David's office, barking orders at software engineers and pretending to be a corporate giant. Patricia and Samantha were likely planning how they would divide my personal belongings tomorrow at noon. They believed they held all the leverage because they possessed a forged will and an emergency court order. They did not understand that corporate debt supersedes inheritance. A will only dictates how positive assets are distributed after all creditors have been paid in full. Since Zenith Solutions owed me $5 million and the collateral securing that debt was their personal homes, they were technically already bankrupt. They just had not received the paperwork yet. I began drafting the formal notice of default. According to the original loan covenants, the next massive interest payment was due on the 1st of the month, which was exactly 5 days away. Jamal, in his total ignorance of the shadow ledgers, would not authorize that payment. He did not even know the loan existed. He would miss the deadline. When the grace period expired, Apex Holdings would be legally authorized to trigger the acceleration clause demanding the entire $5 million principal immediately. When Jamal inevitably failed to produce $5 million in cash, I would execute the collateral seizure. I spent the next hour preparing the preliminary foreclosure documents for all 3 residential properties. I formatted the legal headers, filled in the addresses, and prepared the demand letters. I left the date fields blank, ready to be submitted to the respective county courts the second Jamal defaulted. My financial freeze was complete. My trap was perfectly constructed and fully armed. The offshore account had successfully laundered my involvement. On paper, Apex Holdings was a faceless, ruthless corporate entity based out of Delaware, represented by a high-priced legal team. There was absolutely nothing connecting Claire, the grieving, destitute widow, to the predatory corporation about to swallow Jamal's world whole. I poured the last sip of scotch into my glass and raised it toward the glowing monitors. I toasted to the absolute ruin of the people who thought they could bury me. Tomorrow, I would put on my cheap gray sweater, walk back into the house, and play the role of the shattered victim one last time. I would let them push me out the front door, knowing I held the deed to every single roof over their arrogant heads. The sun crested over the Chicago skyline, casting a harsh, brilliant light against the floor-to-ceiling windows of my penthouse. I had not slept yet. My mind was humming with a terrifying, electric clarity. The purchase of the $5 million toxic debt from Obsidian Credit was officially complete. The digital ink was dry. The bank wire had cleared. I spent the early hours of the morning securing the legal mechanics of my invisible web in corporate finance. Owning the debt is only half the battle. The other half is ensuring your claim is absolutely bulletproof against any bankruptcy proceedings or sudden legal maneuvers by the debtor. I logged into the state's commercial registry database to update the Uniform Commercial Code filings. The forms act as a public declaration of a creditor's interest in a debtor's assets. Obsidian Credit had already filed the initial liens, but I needed to execute a formal assignment of those liens to Apex Holdings. I typed the commands with methodical precision, with a few keystrokes. The liens on the tech company's operational assets, the intellectual property, and the server farms were transferred to my anonymous entity. I did the same for the real estate collateral. I formally transferred the deeds of trust securing the Chicago mansion, the Ohio retirement property belonging to Patricia and Richard, and the Atlanta estate owned by Jamal and Samantha. By 9 o'clock in the morning, the invisible web was completely woven. Apex Holdings was the undisputed primary secured creditor. If Zenith Solutions fell, I held the highest priority claim. No bankruptcy judge, no probate court, and certainly no forged will could supersede my position. I essentially owned the financial souls of the entire Ohio family, and they were completely oblivious. But securing the debt was only the first phase of the operation. I needed to guarantee that Jamal could not escape the federal tax liabilities David had amassed. I opened a secure encrypted communication portal that I frequently utilized to coordinate with federal regulators during hostile liquidations. I drafted an anonymous tip to the Internal Revenue Service Criminal Investigation Division. As a corporate liquidator, I knew exactly what language to use to trigger an immediate high-priority audit. I detailed the exact routing numbers of the dummy accounts David used to siphon the $8 million in employee payroll taxes. I provided the specific dates of the transfers and the tax identification numbers of the shell companies established in Ohio. I did not mention David's death. I simply presented a meticulously documented report of ongoing massive federal tax evasion at Zenith Solutions. Then, I added the final most crucial piece of information. I noted that a new interim chief executive officer, Jamal, had just legally assumed full operational and financial control of the entity. I attached a copy of the emergency corporate injunction Jamal had proudly filed the previous day. I pressed send. The federal tripwire was set. The automated auditing systems would immediately flag the missing $8 million. When the federal agents came knocking, they would not be looking for a dead founder. They would be looking for the arrogant man currently sitting behind the executive desk, actively claiming authority over the stolen funds. My secure phone vibrated on the desk. It was Harrison. The probate court just processed Jamal's latest filings. Harrison reported, his voice a mix of professional awe and disbelief. He is moving incredibly fast. Claire, he just submitted a formal assumption of liability declaration. He is terrified that the court might appoint an independent executor to manage the tech company while the will is being verified. To prevent that, he officially guaranteed the company's operating debts using his own personal assets as a demonstration of financial stability. I smiled, the cold satisfaction spreading all the way to my fingertips. He personally guaranteed the operating debts. He signed a blanket assumption. Harrison confirmed. He thinks the company is a cash cow. He wants to prove to the probate judge that he is the only logical choice to guide Leo's inheritance. He has no idea he just voluntarily co-signed an $8 million federal tax fraud and a $5 million toxic loan. He practically gift-wrapped his own financial execution. Do not object to the filing, I instructed smoothly. Let the judge stamp it. I want Jamal's name permanently cemented to every single liability David left behind. Make sure the court records clearly reflect that his assumption of control is absolute and undisputed. It is done, Harrison said. The hearing to finalize the asset transfer and validate the new will is scheduled for the end of the month. They requested expedited proceedings. Perfect, I replied. Let them rush toward the cliff. I will be at the estate by noon to play my part. I powered down the server rack and stepped away from the glowing monitors. The apex predator was returning to the shadows. It was time to resurrect the fragile, broken widow. I walked into the penthouse bathroom and splashed cold water on my face. I deliberately avoided looking at the expensive skincare products lining the counter. I needed my skin to look dull and exhausted. I pulled my hair into a sloppy, uneven knot, letting loose strands fall haphazardly around my face. I slipped into the cheap, oversized gray sweater and the faded jeans I had packed the night before. The rough fabric felt foreign my skin, a stark contrast to the tailored suits I wore when dismantling corporate empires. I looked in the mirror. The woman staring back at me looked small, defeated, and entirely devoid of power. She looked like a woman who could be easily crushed by an aggressive financial consultant and a cruel mother-in-law. The disguise was flawless. I left the penthouse, the heavy security doors locking automatically behind me. I took the service elevator down to the alleyway and hailed a standard city cab. I gave the driver the address of the $2 million Chicago estate. As the cab navigated through the morning traffic, I practiced my breathing. I made my breath shallow and rapid. I forced my shoulders to slump forward, physically embodying the heavy, suffocating weight of grief and betrayal. When the cab pulled up to the grand wrought iron gates of the estate, I paid the fare with crumpled cash and stepped out into the biting wind. The massive stone house looked exactly as I had left it yesterday. It was a monument to a fraudulent marriage, a beautiful empty shell built on a foundation of lies and stolen money. I walked up the long, curving driveway, dragging my feet slightly, letting the cold air sting my cheeks and coax a natural redness into my eyes. I unlocked the front door and stepped into the silent foyer. The grandfather clock ticked rhythmically in the hallway, counting down the minutes until my carefully orchestrated eviction. I left my small, battered suitcase by the front door, a pathetic symbol of my impending exile. I walked into the living room and sat on the edge of the expensive sofa, staring blankly at the marble fireplace. I was perfectly positioned. The invisible web was fully woven, spanning across state lines, binding the company, the bank accounts, and the very homes my enemies slept in. I just had to wait for them to walk through the front door and claim their hollow victory. The silence of the living room shattered when the heavy oak front door banged open. High heels clicked aggressively against the marble floor of the foyer. I did not move from the edge of the sofa. I kept my eyes fixed on the cold fireplace, letting my shoulders tremble as the footsteps approached. Patricia swept into the room first, wrapped in an expensive trench coat, her eyes scanning the space with absolute disdain. Samantha flanked her, holding a large designer tote bag and wearing a smile so sharp it could cut glass. They did not knock. They did not announce themselves. They simply invaded the space as if I had already ceased to exist. Look at this place, Patricia sneered, running a manicured finger over the edge of a mahogany side table. David had such incredible taste and she completely ruined it with these cheap pedestrian accents. We will need to hire a professional decorator before we list it on the market. Or maybe keep it as a guest house for Rachel and Leo when they visit the city. Samantha laughed, tossing her tote bag onto a velvet armchair. Jamal is already looking into interior designers. He is tied up at the corporate headquarters today, officially restructuring the executive board. He told us to come handle the trash removal. The trash. That was me. I forced a ragged gasp and stood up slowly, clutching the sleeves of my oversized gray sweater. You cannot just walk in here, I said, making my voice waver perfectly. This is still my home. The 48 hours are not up yet. Patricia turned her icy glare toward me. This was never your home. Claire, you were a squatter living on borrowed time. David gave you a temporary lease on a life you could never afford on an administrative assistant's salary. Now the lease is terminated. Before I could offer a pathetic protest, Samantha marched right past me and headed straight for the hallway closet. She threw the doors open and began grabbing the coats and jackets I had intentionally left behind. She did not bother folding them. She yanked them off the hangers in massive, tangled bunches. "What are you doing?" I cried out, rushing forward and hovering helplessly. "Please stop. Those are my things." Samantha ignored me entirely. She marched toward the front door, kicked it wide open, and hurled the bundle of coats directly onto the wet grass of the front lawn. The expensive fabric hit the mud with a dull thud. Patricia followed suit, walking over to the entryway console table. She picked up a framed photograph of David and me from our wedding day. She looked at it for a brief second, her lip curling in disgust, before she casually tossed it out the open door. The glass shattered across the stone porch. "Stop it," I begged, letting tears spill over my cheeks. "I am packing. I am leaving. You do not have to do this." "Oh, but we want to," Samantha said, returning from the master bedroom carrying the cheap suitcase I had packed the night before. She dragged it carelessly down the stairs, the wheels bouncing violently against the wood. She hauled it to the front door and kicked it out onto the porch. It tumbled down the concrete steps, bursting open on the wet lawn. My faded jeans and plain shirts scattered across the damp yard. I ran outside, dropping to my knees on the cold grass, frantically gathering my clothes. The damp chill seeped through my thin sweater immediately. I looked like an absolute wreck, a desperate broken woman desperately trying to salvage scraps of a ruined life. Several cars slowed down as they passed the estate. Neighbors I had politely waved to for years were peering out from their windows, watching the spectacle unfold. I let my shoulders shake, sobbing audibly into my hands. Patricia stepped out onto the porch, looking down at me from her elevated position. "This is the reality you deserve. Claire, you thought you could trick my brilliant son into giving you a life of luxury. But David was always 10 steps ahead of you. He secured his real family. He made sure Rachel and Leo would inherit the empire he built. You get the mud." Samantha stood beside her mother-in-law, filming the scene on her smartphone. "Jamal is going to love this," she said, laughing brightly. "The great Claire finally taking out the trash. Do not bother coming back to the corporate office, either. Security has a photo of your tear-stained face at the front desk. If you step foot near Jamal or the company, you will be arrested. Please, Patricia." I pleaded, looking up at her from the wet ground. "I have no access to my bank accounts. I have nowhere to sleep tonight. Just let me stay one more night to figure out a plan." Patricia's eyes were utterly void of sympathy. "I suggest you walk to a shelter or call one of your low-class friends. This property now belongs to the trust. If you are not off this lawn in 5 minutes, I am calling the police and reporting a hostile trespasser." The heavy front door slammed shut, echoing with a resounding final thud. The deadbolt clicked into place. I was locked out of the $2 million estate. I stayed on my knees for another 60 seconds, keeping my head bowed as a few more neighbor cars drove past. I slowly gathered the scattered shirts and shoved them back into the cheap suitcase. I stood up, shivering slightly in the cold wind. My performance was complete. The audience had bought every single second of the act. I turned my back on the grand stone house and walked down the long driveway toward the street. Patricia and Samantha thought they had just executed a flawless, humiliating eviction. They thought dumping my clothes on the lawn was the ultimate assertion of their dominance. They had no idea they had just aggressively claimed ownership of a property that was already heavily leveraged against a $5 million toxic loan. By physically taking possession of the estate and locking me out, They provided the exact legal evidence I needed to prove their hostile assumption of the assets. In the eyes of the law, their forceful entry established irrefutable control. I pulled my secure phone from my pocket as I reached the sidewalk. I opened a message to my attorney. The text was simple and direct. The eviction is complete. They have taken physical possession of the residential asset. The trap is locked. Harrison replied less than a minute later. Excellent. Jamal just finalized the corporate takeover paperwork downtown. They are fully loaded with the liability. When do we strike? I typed my response without breaking my stride, the cold wind feeling suddenly refreshing against my face. We invite them to a mediation. We let them draft the surrender. I hailed a passing taxi, throwing the dirty suitcase into the trunk. As the car pulled away from the neighborhood, I allowed a small, sharp smile to break across my face. The Ohio family had their fun playing the conquerors. It was time to invite them to the negotiating table and let them sign their own financial death warrants. I directed the taxi to Harrison's downtown law firm. The sprawling glass-walled offices were usually reserved for high-stakes corporate warfare. But today, they would serve as the stage for my ultimate theatrical debut. I bypassed the main reception and took the private elevator straight to Harrison's personal suite. He was waiting for me behind his desk, reviewing a stack of fresh injunctions Jamal had proudly filed that morning. They took the bait on the house, I told Harrison, dropping my muddy suitcase onto his pristine carpet. Patricia and Samantha evicted me. They tossed my clothes onto the lawn and locked the doors. In the eyes of the law, they have formally and aggressively seized the residential asset. Harrison smiled a sharp, predatory grin. Perfect. Jamal is simultaneously filing paperwork to formally integrate David's tech company into a newly formed family trust. He listed himself as the principal managing director. He is binding himself so tightly to the company's liability that he will need a blowtorch to get free. What is the next step? Call their legal counsel. I instructed, sinking into a plush leather chair. Tell them your client is financially exhausted, emotionally broken, and terrified of a protracted legal battle. Request an emergency mediation session for tomorrow morning. Tell them I am ready to surrender the entire estate if they agree to lift the freeze on my personal checking accounts. Make sure you sound frustrated with me. Let them believe you are a high-priced lawyer stuck with a weak, hysterical widow who just wants to run away. Harrison picked up his phone, his eyes gleaming. Consider it done. 48 hours later. I sat in the largest conference room of Harrison's firm. I wore the same cheap gray sweater and faded jeans. I had rubbed at my eyes until they were bloodshot and swollen. I kept my shoulders hunched, staring fixedly at the polished mahogany table, my hands trembling visibly around a lukewarm cup of coffee. The heavy glass doors swung open. Jamal walked in first, wearing a custom-tailored charcoal suit that probably cost more than my first car. He carried himself with the bloated confidence of a conqueror stepping onto vanquished soil. Patricia and Samantha followed, adorned in pristine cashmere coats and carrying designer handbags, casting disgusted glances at my disheveled appearance. Rachel walked in last, holding little Leo by the hand, wearing a subtle, triumphant smirk. They had brought their attorney, a silver-haired, aggressive litigator named Montgomery, who immediately dropped his thick leather briefcase onto the table with a loud, intimidating thud. "Let us make this quick," Montgomery stated, not bothering to offer a greeting. "My clients have busy schedules. Jamal has a company to run. We are here strictly as a courtesy to hear your terms of surrender. Claire." I looked up, letting my bottom lip quiver. I glanced at Jamal, then at Patricia, allowing a single, perfectly timed tear to spill over my eyelashes and run down my cheek. I just want this to stop," I whispered, my voice cracking under the weight of fabricated despair. "I cannot do this anymore. I cannot fight you. You froze my bank accounts. You threw my clothes onto the wet grass. I spent the last 2 nights sleeping on a friend's couch because I cannot even afford a hotel room. Please. You have broken me." Patricia let out a soft, mocking laugh. "You broke yourself, Claire. You tried to cling to a life that never belonged to you. David always intended for Rachel and Leo to have his wealth. We are merely correcting your greedy interference. I am not greedy. I sobbed, burying my face in my hands. I let my shoulders heave, crying loudly into my palms. Inside, behind the wall of my own hands, my face was entirely neutral. I was calculating the exact legal phrasing I needed to extract from them. Harrison placed a comforting hand on my back, playing the role of the sympathetic but defeated attorney. My client is prepared to waive all rights to contest the revised will, Harrison announced to Montgomery. She will formally relinquish any claim to the Chicago estate, the liquid assets, and her spousal share of the tech company. In exchange, we are asking that your clients lift the emergency freeze on her personal checking accounts so she can secure basic living arrangements. And we ask for a signed agreement that your clients will not pursue her for legal fees. Jamal leaned forward, resting his elbows on the mahogany table. He looked at me like a hawk staring at a wounded rabbit. You want to walk away clean? No. Claire, it is not that simple. If we accept your surrender, you sign over everything. You forfeit the estate. You forfeit the company. And you forfeit any future claims to David's legacy. You sign a blanket waiver. I will sign it. I cried, looking up at him with wide, desperate eyes. I do not want the company. Jamal, I do not want anything to do with it or its obligations. Take it. Take the business. Take the house. Take the assets and the liabilities. I just want to be cut free from all of it. Please just take it all so I can move on with my life. Okay? I deliberately threw the word liabilities into the breathless, hysterical rant. I watched Montgomery's eyes narrow for a fraction of a second, but Jamal waved his hand dismissively before the lawyer could process the statement. We gladly accept full ownership and operational control of the entities, Jamal declared, puffing out his chest. I have already stepped in to correct the horrific mismanagement David left behind. We do not need your permission to take the company. Claire, we are taking it. We are simply allowing you to surrender before I bankrupt you in civil court. Thank you. I wept, bowing my head again. Thank you. Jamal, I will sign whatever you draft. Just please make sure the paperwork clearly states that your family is assuming total ownership of the company and all its associated legal obligations. I need to know I am completely severed from his debts. Done. Jamal scoffed. Draft the absolute surrender. Montgomery, include a full assumption of assets and liabilities clause for the family trust. I want her legally barred from ever stepping foot near my company again. Montgomery opened his briefcase and pulled out a gold pen. I will have the documents drafted by this afternoon. We can schedule the final signing and the probate validation hearing for Friday morning. Friday, I whispered, wiping my wet cheeks with the sleeve of my oversized sweater. I will be there. I promise. Patricia stood up, adjusting her cashmere coat. Let us go. Jamal, the air in here is absolutely stifling. I cannot stand looking at her pathetic face for another second. The Ohio family filed out of the conference room, leaving behind a cloud of expensive perfume and staggering arrogance. Rachel cast one final victorious glance over her shoulder before the heavy glass doors swung shut. I sat perfectly still for 5 seconds. Then I slowly lowered my hands from my face. The tears stopped instantly. I reached for my lukewarm coffee, took a slow sip, and turned to Harrison. They took it, I said, my voice dropping back to its cold, natural pitch. Jamal just explicitly demanded the assumption of liabilities clause on the record. Harrison let out a heavy breath, shaking his head in absolute disbelief. He is so eager to prove he is the undisputed king that he just voluntarily chained his entire family to the bottom of the ocean. I will review Montgomery's drafts the second they arrive, if he includes the liability transfer. The trap is locked tight. He will include it. I stated, standing up and smoothing the wrinkles out of my jeans. Jamal's ego demands total control. He wants the legal documentation to prove he conquered me. I walked toward the floor-to-ceiling windows looking out over the city. Friday morning was the final hearing. They were bringing their gold pens and their victory speeches. I was bringing the apocalypse. The documents arrived at our office via an expedited legal courier just before noon the following day. Montgomery had wasted no time, likely propelled by Jamal barking orders over his shoulder. Harrison brought the thick stack of premium legal paper into the conference room and dropped it onto the glass table. The thud echoed like a gavel sealing a guilty verdict. I did not wear the oversized gray sweater today. Behind closed doors with only my attorney present. I wore a tailored charcoal blazer and sharp stilettos. I poured myself a black coffee and pulled the binder toward me. "Let us see how tightly Jamal tied the knot," I said, flipping past the cover page. Harrison sat across from me, a highlighter spinning between his fingers. Montgomery is a seasoned litigator, but you can smell Jamal dictating every single paragraph. The language is incredibly aggressive. It reads less like a standard settlement and more like a total unconditional surrender treaty. I scanned the first section. The asset transfer clauses were exhaustive. Jamal made sure to list every single item of value tied to David's name. The Chicago estate. The offshore accounts he falsely believed I possessed. The intellectual property of Zenith Solutions. The physical servers. The office leases. And every piece of proprietary code. He even included a clause claiming ownership of the furniture currently sitting inside the Chicago house. He wanted to make absolutely certain I walked away with nothing but the clothes on my back. But I was not looking at the assets. Assets are just bait. I was looking for the teeth of the bear trap. I flipped to page 42. Section 4, subsection B. The assumption of liabilities. My eyes traced the dense legal jargon, and a genuine terrifying smile spread across my face. Jamal had outdone himself. In his absolute desperation to prevent me or any court-appointed executor from touching a single dime of Zenith Solutions, he had drafted an ironclad fortress around the company. "Listen to this," I read aloud, my voice steady and crystalline. "The transferee, defined collectively as the family trust, managed by Jamal, Patricia, and Richard, hereby assumes absolute, unconditional, and irrevocable responsibility for all debts, encumbrances, tax obligations, and corporate liabilities associated with Zenith Solutions, whether currently known, pending, or discovered retroactively. The transferee explicitly waives the right to contest any liability claims predating the execution of this agreement." Harrison let out a sharp bark of laughter. He actually put it in writing. He waived the right to contest retroactive liabilities. He is explicitly telling the court and any future creditors that he accepts the company with all its hidden flaws. No questions asked. He wanted to make sure I could never claim a portion of the company by arguing I was liable for its debts. I explained, tapping the page with a manicured fingernail. He thought I might try a backdoor legal maneuver to retain partial ownership by assuming some of the corporate risk. So he slammed that door completely shut. He built a titanium wall to keep me out entirely unaware that he was locking himself inside a burning building with no fire exits. I turned the page, searching for the guarantor signatures. Jamal had not just signed on behalf of the trust. He had attached personal guarantor addendums for himself, Patricia, and Richard. They were putting their own personal wealth on the line to back the company, proving to the probate court that they were highly solvent and capable of managing Leo's inheritance. It was a massive display of financial ego. "Are their primary residences listed in the personal guarantor schedules?" I asked, keeping my eyes glued to the text. Harrison flipped to the back of his copy. Yes, Jamal listed his Atlanta mansion. Patricia and Richard listed their Ohio estate. They offered them up as proof of liquidity. They are legally pledging their own roofs to secure a company that is currently defaulting on a $5 million toxic loan and dodging $8 million in federal taxes. The sheer scale of their stupidity was breathtaking. David had already secretly leveraged their homes to secure the shadow loan from Obsidian Credit. Now Jamal was legally validating those exact liens in a formal settlement agreement submitted to a probate judge. By signing this document, Jamal was verifying to the court properties were valid collateral for Zenith Solutions. He was doing my job for me. He was handing Apex Holdings a perfectly wrapped court-approved mandate to foreclose on his entire family. Sign it. I commanded, tossing the document back onto the table. Sign everything. Initial every page. Do not contest a single comma. Harrison grabbed his pen. Are you entirely sure about this? Claire. Once you sign this, you legally relinquish all marital claims to the estate. If your anonymous proxy purchase of the debt somehow falls through, you will actually be left with nothing. The debt purchase is already secured. I stated, opening my laptop to verify the final wire transfers from Apex Holdings. I hold the paper. I hold the liens. This contract just makes my collection process completely frictionless. They are right to fight me. I took the heavy gold pen from Harrison and began signing my name on the surrender documents. I signed away the $2 million house I had meticulously decorated. I signed away the tech company I had watched David build from a tiny rented office. I signed away every last scrap of the life I thought I had. With every stroke of the pen, I felt a heavy, suffocating layer of my past falling away. I was not losing an empire. I was shedding a massive toxic anchor. When I reached the final page, I signed my name with a flourish. I pushed the stack of papers across the desk. Send them back to Montgomery, I instructed. Tell him I am devastated. Tell him I spent the entire morning crying in your office. Tell him I am terrified of Jamal and just want the probate hearing to be over so I can disappear. Harrison gathered the documents, placing them carefully into a secure folder. He looked at me with a mixture of fear and profound respect. The final probate hearing is scheduled for tomorrow at 9 o'clock in the morning at the Central Courthouse. The judge will officially enter this settlement into the public record and transfer the assets. I stood up and buttoned my blazer. Tomorrow morning, I'm going to walk into that courtroom wearing my cheap sweater and my faded jeans. I am going to let Patricia glare at me. I am going to let Rachel hold her son and gloat. I am going to let Jamal stand before the judge and proudly declare himself the new king of Zenith Solutions. And the exact second the judge drops the gavel and finalizes this contract, I am going to detonate the bomb. I walked out of Harrison's office and into the bustling Chicago street. The cold air felt electric. For the last 5 years, I had been a pawn in a game I did not even know I was playing. David had used my stability to fund his secret life. His family had used my grief to stage a hostile takeover, but they had all made a fatal miscalculation. They forgot to ask what I did for a living. I spent my days breaking arrogant corporations and liquidating fraudulent men. And tomorrow, I was going to liquidate my own family. The heavy oak doors of the Cook County Probate Courthouse swung open, revealing a cavernous hall lined with marble pillars and echoing with the hushed, frantic of 100 different legal battles. I walked through the metal detectors with my head bowed, shivering in the oversized gray sweater. Harrison walked beside me carrying a single slim briefcase. He played the part of the grim, defeated counselor, perfectly matching my slow, hesitant pace as we made our way to courtroom 4. We took our seats at the petitioner table. The room was mostly empty save for a bored bailiff and a court reporter organizing her transcript machine. 10 minutes later, the double doors at the back of the courtroom opened with a forceful, dramatic swoosh. Jamal led the procession. He wore a navy pinstripe suit that screamed Wall Street aggression, his stride long and commanding. Patricia and Richard followed closely behind him, dressed in somber but impeccably tailored dark clothing, looking every bit the grieving but dignified. Aristocratic parents. Samantha walked next to her mother carrying a crocodile skin handbag and wearing an expression of pure, unadulterated smugness. Rachel brought up the rear holding little Leo by the hand. Rachel wore a tasteful black dress and a string of pearls that I recognized instantly. They were the pearls David had bought for my 30th birthday. I felt a fleeting rush of bile in my throat, but I immediately swallowed it down, forcing my eyes to fill with manufactured, humiliated tears. Montgomery, their silver-haired attorney, marched directly to the respondent table and slammed his thick leather briefcase down. He did not even bother to look in my direction. He immediately began pulling out the heavy stacks of premium legal paper, organizing them for the judge. Jamal did not sit down. He walked around the wooden partitions separating our tables and stood directly over me. I shrank back in my wooden chair, pulling the sleeves of my cheap sweater over my knuckles. "I am glad you decided to show up." "Claire," Jamal said, his deep voice echoing in the quiet courtroom. "For a moment yesterday, I thought you might try to run and drag this out. It is good to see you finally accepting reality." I kept my eyes glued to the scuffed toes of my boots. "I just want it to be over." I whispered, my voice shaking with a perfectly calibrated tremor. "I signed everything your lawyer asked for. Just please let me go after this." Samantha leaned over the wooden rail, getting close enough that I could smell her expensive floral perfume. "You will be free to go back to your miserable little life," Samantha hissed quietly. "David built an empire and you contributed absolutely nothing to it. You are just a clerical worker who got lucky for a few years. It is time for the real family to take charge of the assets." Harrison stood up, positioning himself between me and my aggressive in-laws. "That is enough," he stated firmly. "My client has agreed to a total unconditional surrender of the marital assets to avoid further emotional distress. There is no need for grandstanding. We are just waiting for the judge to formalize the decree." Jamal laughed, a rich, booming sound of pure victory. "I am not grandstanding. Counselor, I am just making sure the administrative assistant understands her place in the corporate hierarchy." The heavy door behind the bench opened, and the judge entered the room. Everyone scrambled to stand. The bailiff called the court to order, and we all took our seats. The judge, a stern-looking man with sharp eyes, put on his reading glasses and opened the massive file Montgomery had submitted. "This is a highly unusual settlement." The judge began looking directly at me. "Mrs. Reynolds, I am looking at a comprehensive waiver of your spousal rights. You are relinquishing all claims to the primary residential estate in Chicago, all liquid capital within the marital accounts, and your entire stake in Zenith Solutions. Furthermore, you are allowing the interim chief executive officer, Jamal, and the family trust to assume total operational and financial control." "Yes, Your Honor," I squeaked out, wiping a fake tear from my cheek. The judge frowned, clearly concerned by my disheveled appearance and apparent desperation. "Are you absolutely certain you understand the magnitude of this document? You are walking away with nothing. Have you been coerced or threatened into signing this agreement?" Harrison stood up. "Your Honor, my client is fully aware of the terms. The sudden passing of her husband and the revelation of a secondary family have taken a severe emotional toll. She wishes to cleanly sever all ties to the estate and avoid a lengthy public probate battle over the resources." Montgomery stood up next, adjusting his tie with an arrogant flick of his wrists. "Your Honor, my clients are stepping in to secure the legacy of the deceased for his rightful biological heir, to ensure the absolute stability of the tech company. My client Jamal has formally signed an assumption of liabilities clause. The family trust is taking the assets, but they are also taking 100% of the risk. We are shielding the widow from any future corporate fallout." The judge looked at the specific liability assumption clause. He raised his eyebrows. "You are guaranteeing all corporate debts, known and unknown, Mr. Jamal." Jamal stood up tall, buttoning his suit jacket. "Yes, Your Honor. I am a senior financial consultant. I have already begun restructuring the executive board. Zenith Solutions is a highly profitable entity, and I am fully prepared to manage its obligations to protect my nephew's inheritance." I stared at the floor, biting the inside of my cheek to keep from smiling. Jamal was practically begging the judge to lock him in the burning building. He was actively volunteering to take the hit for an $8 million federal tax fraud and a $5 million toxic loan. Very well, the judge said, raising his pen. If all parties are in agreement and fully comprehend the irrevocable nature of these transfers, I will finalize the order immediately. The judge signed the primary decree. He handed the documents to the bailiff, who carried them over to our tables for the final execution signatures. Montgomery slid the thick stack toward Jamal. Jamal picked up his heavy gold fountain pen. He looked over at me, his eyes burning with absolute unchecked triumph. He thought he had just executed the greatest financial coup of his life. He thought he had completely obliterated a weak, uneducated woman. With a swift, arrogant motion, Jamal signed his name on the bottom line, officially binding himself, Patricia Richard, and Samantha to the massive, toxic crater David had left behind. Patricia clapped her hands together in silent delight. Rachel leaned down and kissed little Leo on the forehead, whispering that they were finally rich. Samantha pulled out her phone, likely preparing to send a gloating message to her country club friends in Atlanta. The trap snapped violently shut. The heavy steel doors of financial ruin locked firmly into place around the entire Ohio family. The gavel fell with a loud, echoing crack. "The matter is settled," the judge announced. "Assets and liabilities are hereby transferred to the family trust. Court is adjourned." I slowly lifted my head. The tears instantly vanished from my eyes. The trembling in my shoulders stopped completely. I sat back in my chair, uncrossed my ankles, and let a slow, terrifying smile spread across my face. The miserable victim performance was officially over. It was time for the corporate liquidator to go ahead and completely dismantle their stolen lives. The judge gathered his dark robes and exited the courtroom through his private chamber door. The exact second the heavy wood clicked shut, the stifling silence of the room was broken by Patricia letting out a loud, victorious exhale. Jamal turned toward me, a wide, predatory grin stretching across his face. He buttoned his suit jacket with a sharp, arrogant motion and stepped away from the respondent table. "I expect you to be entirely off the estate grounds by sunset," Claire Jamal commanded, his deep voice echoing in the empty hall. "Leave the keys on the kitchen island. Do not take a single piece of artwork or furniture. My team will be conducting a thorough inventory tomorrow morning." I did not cower. I did not avert my eyes. Instead, I stood up from my wooden chair. I grabbed the hem of the cheap, oversized gray sweater and pulled it over my head, tossing it carelessly onto the petitioner table. Underneath, I wore a sharply tailored charcoal gray silk blouse that cost more than Montgomery's entire briefcase. I reached up and pulled the messy hair tie from my head, letting my hair fall neatly around my shoulders. I straightened my spine, instantly gaining several inches in height. The weeping, defeated widow evaporated into the sterile courtroom air. Patricia stopped mid-laugh. Samantha lowered her designer handbag, her smug expression faltering as she processed my sudden, aggressive physical transformation. Rachel pulled little Leo closer to her side, her eyes darting nervously toward the heavy courtroom doors. "What do you think you are doing?" Samantha snapped, stepping closer to her husband. "Put your coat on and get out of our sight." I ignored her completely. I turned to Harrison, who was already unlocking the hidden bottom compartment of his slim briefcase. He was no longer playing the role of a defeated, frustrated counselor. He stood up tall, his eyes locked onto Montgomery with the lethal intensity of a shark smelling blood in the water. "The probate proceedings are officially concluded," I stated, my voice ringing off the marble walls with a cold, razor-sharp authority that made Jamal freeze in his tracks. "You have legally assumed full ownership of Zenith Solutions and its entire portfolio of liabilities, which means, Jamal, it is time for us to discuss your outstanding debts." Montgomery frowned, his thick gray eyebrows knitting together in immediate suspicion. We have no debts to you. The settlement is absolute. You waived all spousal support claims and walked away from the business. I did waive my spousal claims. I agreed smoothly. I walked slowly around the wooden partition until I stood mere inches from Jamal, forcing him to look me dead in the eye. But I did not waive my rights as your primary secured creditor. Jamal let out a harsh, dismissive scoff. You are not a creditor. You are an administrative assistant who just got legally fired from her own life. We owe you absolutely nothing. Harrison, I said, not breaking eye contact with my arrogant brother-in-law. Please serve the newly appointed acting chief executive officer of Zenith Solutions with his default notices. Harrison stepped forward and dropped a massive, heavily bound stack of legal documents directly onto Montgomery's open briefcase. The resulting thud was deafening. What is the meaning of this? Montgomery demanded, his seasoned legal instincts finally sensing that he had just walked his clients directly into a catastrophic invisible ambush. That, I said, an icy smile spreading across my face, is the reality of the empire you just begged a judge to let you keep. Montgomery opened the thick leather binder Harrison had slammed onto the table. His experienced eyes darted across the top page, scanning the formal federal letterhead. Within seconds, the arrogant color completely drained from his face. He looked like a man who had just stepped on a live landmine. What is this? Jamal demanded, snatching the top document out of his lawyer's hands. He stared at the densely packed numbers, his brow furrowing as he tried to comprehend the complex legal language. That is a formal notification from the Internal Revenue Service, Criminal Investigation Division, Harrison explained, his voice projecting a calm, terrifying authority. Your brother-in-law David was not the tech visionary you all believed him to be. He was running a massive, highly illegal shadow ledger for the past 3 years. He systematically stole the federal tax withholdings from his entire payroll. Patricia gasped, clutching her designer handbag against her chest. Stoll David would never do such a thing. He was a brilliant executive. He was a federal criminal. I corrected sharply, turning my cold gaze to my horrified mother-in-law. He routed $8 million in stolen employee taxes through dummy shell corporations to fund his secret life in Ohio. He used federal money to buy Rachel's estate, lease your luxury vehicles, and secure Leo's private trust fund. The company you just aggressively claimed ownership of is entirely hollow. It has zero actual liquid capital. Jamal threw the paper back onto the table, his chest heaving rapidly. This is a pathetic bluff. I personally reviewed the corporate filings. The public balance sheets were perfectly clean. You reviewed the fabricated public filings, I said, taking a deliberate step closer to him. You did not order a deep forensic audit because you were too arrogant to believe a grieving widow could outsmart you. If you had performed basic corporate due diligence, you would have found the gaping financial crater hiding behind his flashy marketing budgets. You were so desperate to steal my house and crown yourself the new king of Zenith Solutions that you blindly signed a blanket assumption of liability. Montgomery slowly looked up at Jamal, his professional composure completely shattered. Jamal, Montgomery whispered, his voice trembling with sheer panic. You signed a binding guarantee in front of a probate judge. You explicitly waived the right to contest any retroactive liabilities. The federal government will not pursue a dead man. They are going to go after the acting chief executive officer who just legally claimed responsibility for the corporate accounts. Jamal stumbled backward, his hip hitting the edge of the respondent table. His dark eyes went wide with sudden, suffocating realization. $8 million, he choked out, staring at the scattered documents as if they were venomous snakes. Payable immediately to the federal government, Harrison added cheerfully. But that is only the beginning of your problems today. The massive tax fraud is just the appetizer. Claire, would you like to present the main course? I stepped forward, pulling a slim black folder from Harrison's briefcase. I placed it gently on the wooden table right next to the devastating tax documents. Patricia let out a whimpering sound, clutching Richard's arm. Samantha looked frantically between her husband and her lawyer, her arrogant facade entirely dismantled. I opened the folder and spread 3 crisp legal documents across the mahogany surface. "These are formal notices of default," I announced, ensuring my voice carried to the back of the courtroom. 8 months ago, David was bleeding cash so rapidly that he resorted to taking a $5 million mezzanine loan from a predatory shadow lender known as Obsidian Credit. The interest rate was 30% compounded monthly, and it included an immediate acceleration clause upon any missed payment. Jamal stared at the paper, sweat beading on his forehead. "We missed the payment," Jamal concluded, panic rising in his chest. "You missed the payment 3 days ago," I confirmed with a sharp nod. "But the most interesting part of that toxic loan is the collateral David pledged to secure it. He forged my signature to use the Chicago estate. But he also needed more leverage. He needed clean residential assets." I slid the first foreclosure notice directly in front of Patricia and Richard. "David pledged your sprawling retirement property in Ohio," I said, watching Richard's jaw drop in absolute horror. "He used your blank surety bonds to cross-collateralize his debt." Then I slid the second document in front of Samantha. "He also pledged your luxury gated mansion in Atlanta, utilizing the blank advisory agreements Jamal signed 5 years ago." David effectively handed the bank the deeds to every single roof over your heads. Montgomery snatched the documents from the table, his hands shaking violently as he reviewed the legal covenants. "He cannot do that." Montgomery stammered, frantically flipping pages. "These liens would be tied up in probate court for a decade. A standard bank would never seize immediately." "You are absolutely right," I agreed smoothly. "A standard bank would hate the friction of collecting residential collateral across 3 different state lines. Obsidian Credit wanted an immediate exit when David died. They were desperate to sell that highly distressed debt for pennies on the dollar to any private entity willing to assume the collection risk." Montgomery stopped breathing. His eyes darted to the top of the foreclosure notices, locking onto the creditor letterhead. "Apex Holdings." Montgomery read aloud, his voice dropping to a terrified whisper. He scanned down to the execution signature line at the bottom of the demand letters. All the color drained from his face, leaving him looking like a ghost standing in a tailored suit. He looked at Jamal, then slowly turned his horrified gaze toward me. Jamal slammed his hands on the table. "What is it?" Jamal demanded, his voice cracking. "Who is Apex Holdings?" I tilted my head, locking eyes with my arrogant brother-in-law. "Read the name of the chief executive officer, Montgomery." Montgomery swallowed hard, his hands trembling so severely the paper rattled. "The registered owner and chief executive officer of Apex Holdings is Claire Reynolds." He gasped. The absolute silence that followed Montgomery's declaration felt heavier than the crushing Chicago winter. For 10 agonizing seconds, nobody moved. The air was entirely sucked out of the courtroom, leaving the Ohio family drowning in the sudden, inescapable reality of their own destruction. Jamal stared at me, his mouth opening and closing like a suffocating fish. The arrogant, bespoke financial consultant who had mocked me at my husband's grave was entirely gone. In his place stood a man realizing he had just willingly signed over his entire life to a woman he had severely underestimated. "You bought the debt," Jamal choked out, his voice a ragged whisper echoing off the marble walls. "You used an anonymous shell company to buy the mezzanine loan from the private equity firm. You own the liens on our houses. I own the liens on your houses." I confirmed, taking a deliberate step forward until I was standing directly in his personal space. "I own the $8 million federal tax obligation you just formally and proudly assumed. And I own the company you just fought so desperately to claim. You walked into this courtroom demanding the crown, Jamal. Congratulations. You are now the undisputed king of a massive burning crater. You have exactly 30 days to wire $5 million to my corporate holding account, or I will personally execute the foreclosure on your Atlanta mansion." A sharp, piercing shriek tore through the courtroom. Patricia collapsed against the wooden railing, grabbing her chest as if she had been shot. She looked at Richard, her face contorted in absolute, primal terror. "Our house!" Patricia wailed, grabbing her husband's lapels and shaking him. "Richard, she is going to take our house. Where are we supposed to go? We are retired. We have absolutely nothing else." Richard turned his horrified gaze toward Jamal. "You said the company was clean," Richard shouted, his face turning an angry, mottled red. "You told us you reviewed the filings. You told us signing the guarantor forms was just a formality to secure the inheritance. You promised us this was a gold mine. Do not you dare blame me for this disaster." Jamal roared, turning fiercely on his father-in-law, completely dropping his professional facade. "Your lying sociopathic son is the one who took out the toxic loan. Your son is the one who stole $8 million from the federal government. David used my signature to forge a collateral agreement. I am ruined because you raised a criminal." Samantha shoved Jamal hard in the chest, her expensive crocodile skin handbag slipping from her shoulder and crashing to the floor with a heavy thud. "How could you be so stupid?" Samantha screamed, her voice cracking as she completely abandoned her polished country club persona. "You are supposed to be a high-level financial expert. You just handed this administrative assistant the legal right to seize our home. My friends are going to see a foreclosure sign on our front lawn. You promised me we were taking over a tech empire. I am not an administrative assistant." I stated, my voice slicing through their vicious infighting like a steel blade. "I am a senior corporate liquidator. I dismantle fraudulent companies for a living. I tear apart arrogant executives who think they can hide their toxic assets behind flashy public relations." David knew exactly what I did, which is why he kept his shadow ledgers highly encrypted. "You thought I was a helpless, uneducated widow. You let your prejudice blind you to the fact that you were walking directly into an execution chamber." Rachel, who had been standing frozen near the back of the group, suddenly yanked little Leo backward. Her eyes darted from the foreclosure notices on the table to the federal tax documents. She realized instantly that the grand inheritance she had been banking on was completely non-existent. The $2 million Chicago estate was heavily leveraged. The tech company was an $8 million federal crime scene. She was getting absolutely nothing but a front-row seat to a bankruptcy hearing. "I am leaving," Rachel announced, her voice trembling as she scooped up her son. "I want no part of this mess. David lied to me. He told me he was a millionaire." "You cannot leave," Patricia shrieked, reaching out a desperate hand toward Rachel. "Leo is David's only heir. You have to help us fight this." "Fight it with what money?" Rachel snapped, her own greedy facade entirely dropping as survival instinct took over. "You are bankrupt. Your son was a total fraud. I am taking my child and going back to Ohio before the Internal Revenue Service decides to investigate anyone associated with that company." Rachel turned on her heel and practically sprinted out of the courtroom, dragging a crying Leo behind her. Patricia watched her ultimate prize vanish through the heavy oak doors, letting out a hollow, devastated sob. The perfect family image they had clung to was completely annihilated. They had turned on each other the exact second the money disappeared. Jamal turned back to me, the anger draining out of his face, replaced by a raw, pathetic desperation. He took a hesitant step forward, holding his hands up in a gesture of absolute surrender. "Claire, listen to me," Jamal pleaded, his voice cracking with panic. "We can reverse this. We can file an emergency motion to dissolve the settlement. You do not have to foreclose on our homes. We are family. We can figure out a payment plan. Please, you cannot put us on the street." I looked at the man who had shoved a forged will into my chest at my husband's funeral. I looked at the woman who had thrown my clothes into the mud. I looked at the parents who had harbored a secret life while watching me endure the agony of failed fertility treatments. "We are not family," I replied, my voice completely devoid of warmth or sympathy. Family does not ambush a grieving wife at a cemetery. Family does not freeze a woman's grocery money to starve her into submission. You played a ruthless, aggressive game of corporate theft, and you lost. The documents are signed. The judge has officially entered the decree. You legally own the liability, and I legally own the debt. I expect the $5 million payment in exactly 30 days. If the wire transfer does not clear by noon, I will have the sheriffs physically remove you from your properties. But we will be homeless, Samantha sobbed, openly weeping as the reality of her impending poverty set in. You are destroying us. I am simply collecting a debt, I said, picking up my black folder and sliding the documents inside. You destroyed yourselves. I turned my back on the weeping, broken remnants of David's family, and walked toward the exit. Harrison walked right beside me, closing his briefcase with a sharp, satisfying snap. The sound of their vicious arguing and hysterical crying echoed off the marble walls, fading entirely as the heavy courtroom doors closed securely behind us. We stepped out of the courthouse and into the crisp, bright Chicago morning. The dark clouds from the previous days had finally broken, leaving the sky a brilliant, blinding blue. I took a deep breath of the freezing air, feeling completely weightless. I had lost a fraudulent marriage, but I had secured my absolute freedom. I was a 33-year-old corporate liquidator with a massive offshore war chest, a clean slate, and a brilliant career ahead of me. I walked down the courthouse steps, leaving the ashes of my past behind, completely ready to conquer whatever empire came next. Harrison turned to me as we reached the bottom of the wide concrete stairs. A look of profound respect etched across his features. He shook his head slowly, admiring the sheer precision of the financial demolition we had just finalized inside those walls. You really did not leave them a single way out, Harrison remarked, adjusting his overcoat against the brisk wind. The Internal Revenue Service is going to tear through Jamal's accounts by the end of the fiscal quarter. He will be facing federal indictment before the leaves change color. They built a house out of greed, I replied, looking up at the towering glass skyscrapers of the financial district. I simply provided the wind. I hailed a passing taxi, slipping into the back seat, and leaving the courthouse and the treacherous family trapped inside it firmly in the rearview mirror. My new life was just beginning, and it belonged exclusively to me. The harrowing narrative of Claire dismantling her treacherous in-laws serves as a profound exploration of betrayal. More importantly, it highlights a crucial life lesson about how true power lies in absolute independence and emotional detachment from toxic relationships. Often we are conditioned to blindly trust those who share our blood or our name, believing that familial bonds naturally equate to unconditional loyalty. However, as the story masterfully demonstrates, predators frequently wear the mask of family. When Claire was faced with the ultimate betrayal at her most vulnerable moment during her husband's funeral, her survival did not stem from weeping or begging for the empathy her in-laws inherently lacked. Instead, her salvation was born from the fact that she had quietly built her own foundation entirely separate from the fragile and fraudulent empire her husband had constructed. She did not rely on their validation or their financial support. By severing her emotional expectations, she gained the clarity needed to see the situation for what it actually was. It was a hostile takeover by greedy and arrogant people who were completely blinded by their own hubris. The antagonists engineered their own spectacular downfall simply because they believed their cruelty would go unchecked. The story teaches us that we cannot the malicious actions or the hidden agendas of others, but we can absolutely control our perimeter. Building self-reliance, whether emotional, professional, or financial, is not an act of selfishness. It is an essential armor against those who seek to exploit our grief and vulnerability for their own gain. Ultimately, the greatest justice is elevating yourself to a position where the actions of toxic people can no longer touch you. If you have ever felt manipulated by those closest to you, take the first step today to secure your own independence and build a life completely